Okay. Let's begin. And I want to say a couple of things up front. First of all, there are 3 people, I think 3, who have not turned in quiz 2. Your present company here is good, but you're like 3 people, so. But at any rate, it's still open. You can turn it in for reduced credit. But I read over, I didn't assign grades yet, but I did look at them. And it looked like you guys, just on the face of it, did pretty much what I asked you to do. Cut and paste those sources from the library, and I was okay with that. I want to see them all before I assign grades. But that being said, what I want to do today is kind of talk to you a little bit more about Dutch realism. And then I have a video on formal analysis. And I got a PowerPoint on bibliography, and then we'll take, if we still have time, take a look at Rococo and neoclassicism in Europe. So that being said, Jacob van Ruysdael, View of Haarlem from the Dunes at Overveen, circa 1670. Last week, I made a reference to the Low Countries, and that is what that is the Dutch culture. It's the Netherlands. It's and some people include Belgium, which includes Flanders and so on. But at any rate, it's at northeast corner of continental Europe. And so anyway, this is a pretty good indication of why they call this the Low Countries. And what they did, they were very industrious, the Dutch. And what they did was basically reclaim a lot of land right from the sea. They built dikes and levees. And when they were able to kind of keep the sea at bay, if you will, were very prosperous. This was very fertile land. And you can see here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here because I think this is important. What you see here, these are windmills. And the Dutch they used wind power. They used wind power to, in part, move water. And in a big way, they used wind power to grind wheat. They would have a mill. That's what you would actually call a real mill. And basically, they would turn that wheat into flour. But at any rate, so you see, they're really all over the landscape. And you can see here, the prominent building is the church. Very European. And you can see in the painting how orderly everything is. And they were really very good at creating an orderly environment. And so I want to add a little something to that. The Dutch were in on the early phases of colonialism. They were prosperous. They had merchant ships. They didn't have this big, huge army, but they did colonize different parts of the world. And one of them, as I mentioned earlier, was Manhattan Island, New York, which is present day Manhattan. And you know that one of the neighborhoods on Manhattan Island in the borough of Manhattan is Harlem. And so that was called New Amsterdam back in this century. And so they did a lot of things. They did a lot of trading. The Dutch had settled in different places. When I was in Kirksville, there was a little town not far away in Iowa, Pella, Iowa. And they were the place that the big industry there is doors and windows, Pella doors, Pella windows. See the commercials on TV actually still a lot. And one thing that they do still, is that they grow tulips. And every May in Pella, Iowa, they have a tulip festival. And tulips, for some reason, were very prized flowers. And the Dutch made a lot of money by raising tulips and selling the bulbs and things. And so anyway, it was kind of their culture. They were kind of more laid back than a few of the other cultures of the era. But at any rate, this is where it all happened. The other part I want to point out here is this idea of realism. And so Roysdale painted a landscape, but it's not like this glorious landscape. It's not a place where there was a battle to be fought with armies all around on either side. It's not majestic. It's not like they painted big mountains and things. It was just basically what things look like. And this idea of realism really takes hold in the Low Countries, and we actually call this Dutch realism. And I showed you some Rembrandt last class period, and these artists will actually take that idea of realism to yet another level. And so here he is, Roysdale Jewish Cemetery. And so here it is. It's, I don't know, can I ask you guys how many of you would hang this up in your living room? I'm seeing some, no, I don't think so. See, but this is realism. They would bring reality back into art. And what we've seen actually since this class began was a lot of heroic depictions, a lot of religious stories. We've seen the glorification of nobility, kings and queens, and the rich people. These Dutch were into painting everyday, ordinary things. We saw a little bit of that last week with the hunters in the snow, and so on. But bottom line is that this really takes hold. And it is no coincidence that Protestantism takes hold in this part of Europe. And in fact, they're almost all Protestants. And part of the reason it took hold is that Protestantism was seen more as a populist movement. It was actually the Christians who were rebelling against the authority of the papacy. And we've seen that. We saw that, you can go over to England at this very same time and see that the Christians mostly all belong to the Church of England. And you see the Protestants versus the Catholics, and you see a lot of this is played out into this century. Look at Ireland. Protestant versus Catholic. And in fact, they've been at war with each other. In fact, until, just recently. And so anyway, religion has a lot to do with how they see the world, to be sure. And this is a much more populist kind of approach to do everyday things in everyday places as, quote, realism. And here's Johannes Vermeer. And again, view of Delft. And it is, like I say, the Dutch were very orderly in everything. You see, they have the bridges, they have the piers, they have the ships in here and so on. But everything is kind of small compared to what you see up here, which is the environment. And as a matter of fact, a lot of people have analyzed this kind of painting, and they show these people on such a small scale, and it's likened to the fact that the people are actually pretty small compared to the city, and the city is small compared to the environment. And so Vermeer makes a career. Vermeer is the other great painter of the 17th century. And this is what he's famous for. Woman holding a balance, 17th century. This one actually belongs to the National Gallery in DC. As a matter of fact, I like to brag about this, but I had seen the big Vermeer show about 15 years ago, maybe 20 now. It's been a while. They had a collection. They collected Vermeer paintings, and they had them at the Metropolitan Museum, and it was a blockbuster show. Vermeer is extremely popular, probably right there with Rembrandt as a great 17th century painter. And what is so appealing about his work is that it is ordinary people, ordinary things. We're not looking at kings and queens and saints and generals and gods. This is a woman holding a balance. And you can see here what she's doing. It's kind of unclear, but it looks like she may be weighing pearls. Why would pearls be there? Well, in part because the Dutch had their ships out and they were trading around the world. And they were actually trading their tulip bulbs for pearls and so on. But at any rate, we see in the background here an allegorical painting, and you can see up here this is Christ, and you can kind of figure this is a Last Judgment kind of depiction here. But at any rate, it's real. And you guys, I keep referring to this, and partly because I think it is so spot on. David Hockney's Secrets of the Old Masters. And in the part that we saw in this class, he had showed how mathematically he had a mathematician, he had made a scale model that could figure out how Vermeer did this. And basically what he had set up there was a room with a window, and the light came in. And you see, this is like typical Vermeer, is that light will come from this way. You can see she's lit on the front. Bottom line is that we believe that Vermeer had this kind of setup where he had, in this room, created something of the camera obscura. And it projected this image, his model, onto a wall behind all of this. And that's why he was able to achieve such a high degree of accuracy. Now, this is not new. We know that the Dutch have been doing this kind of, they had this kind of technology for actually 200, 250 years, since the days of Van Eyck. But at any rate, Vermeer does this. He has his setup. And here is another Vermeer. It's kind of set up the same way. And you can see here, this is a painting. This is always like I showed you with Velázquez. The idea of putting the back of one of their own paintings in here. But the letter, and here is the maidservant delivering the letter. Here is, this is all done. This is this piece right here. Do you recognize this? It is the cover art for our textbook, The Allegory of the Art of Painting. And in this case, he's actually put himself, or a model, in this space. And again, like I say, we've been able to kind of accurately figure out the dimensions of the furniture, the dimensions of the room. And again, this light that comes in through the window. And again, Dutch realism. So it's not only ordinary people, it's everyday things. And it has a high degree of illusionism, which makes it real as well. And so, yeah, I would put this chandelier, say, right up against Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini and his wife painting. So anyway, this is Dutch realism at its finest. Jan Steen, Feast of St. Nicholas. Ordinary people. Everyday thing. This is not kings and queens. These are people celebrating what is essentially Christmas. St. Nicholas, the precursor to Santa Claus. And so anyway, the presents, the giving the gifts, the food, the spoiled brat over here didn't get what he wanted. You know, just, and I would tie that into the kind of ideas that we start to see in Velázquez, Las Meninas. Of course, Velázquez was a court painter and he worked for King Philip, but he still aspired to make these kinds of scenes that were much more real than the Stoic, than the pose, than the staged. And in a lot of ways, not particularly theatric, not overly theatric, but people are common everyday lives, common everyday expressions. And again, still life with the late Ming ginger jar. Whoa. Again. Still life. This is the tradition this comes out of. And I'd like to kind of point out a couple of things that I've been saying a lot of, and that is that these self-portraits and sometimes these still lifes actually served as advertising. I am so good. My name's Willem Kalf, and I am so good that I can paint this orange that's just been peeled, and I can get it painted before it starts to turn. So anyway, there'll be a lot of that. You'll see a lot of other kinds of very time sensitive subjects. And so something else I want to point out, late Ming ginger jar. Now, what the heck is that?
That's from the Ming Dynasty.
That is exactly where it's from. It's from China. And so you see, this is what I was talking about the Dutch being very prosperous and creating trade networks all around the globe. So yeah, the fact that they would come back with Ming Dynasty pottery, blue pottery, which is really highly prized. And so, yeah, this is kind of a symbol of wealth, and it's kind of an everyday thing, and it's kind of a, look at me, how well I can paint. If you want me to do your portrait, if you want me to do anything, here I am. I'm this good. Rachel Roach, again, same principle. Flowers still life after 1700. So this is kind of, we're getting into the early 18th century, but Dutch realism. And so this one's kind of an interesting play here too. She's got most of these before they had wilted, and she's got some of them that are budding, but she still, she got some that are kind of starting to go. Realism. Realism, Dutch realism. And so that's Dutch. This is French. Louis XIV, Hyacinth Rigaud, 1701, Louis XIV. What we see going on in France is not the same as what's going on in the Low Countries. It's a complete cultural shift. What we have in France is a thriving monarchy. And that monarchy, I'm gonna see what my chat said. Oh. And okay, Natalie, we'll do it. So bottom line, we still have some of the old order happening in France. And they make a lot of money too. And they are colonizing in a pretty major way. They colonize the place we're at right now. This was Louisiana, named after a French king, not this one, but Louis IX. But bottom line, they had colonies all over the place. Vietnam was a French colony, for instance. Much of North Africa and the Middle East was colonized by the French. And a few places in South America, a few places in the Pacific, Tahiti, Haiti, just saying. So anyway, this is the era, and here we go. What I like about this is it does show all of the trappings of royalty, and something I like to zoom in on, the fleur-de-lis. You guys see that St. Louis flag flying around? I got one in front of my house, actually. Got a yellow circle and a blue fleur-de-lis, red background, the rivers. So fleur-de-lis. What does that mean? I mean, it's associated with French. And how many are football fans? Let's see, yeah, Westcott. Brandon's saying, yeah.
My dad.
Yeah, good. Raised you right. Bottom line. Who has the fleur-de-lis on their helmet in the NFL?
New Orleans Saints.
New Orleans Saints, part of the Louisiana colonies, French town, still got the French Quarter. Still a lot of people speak French there. And of course, they had a big chunk of Canada as well. But fleur-de-lis, and this is the motif, this becomes the royal symbol of France. It becomes to symbolize France. And I want to tell you a little bit about how that came to be. And partly because we didn't do Gothic in this class. But if you go back to the Gothic, the French kind of got on their feet, so to speak. They organized the government, their religion organized, and they came out of the so-called Middle Ages pretty strong. They built major cathedrals. And as such, if you were in ADAH 100, you would know that a lot of those French cathedrals are named Notre Dame in some way or another. Notre Dame of Reims, Notre Dame of Paris, Notre Dame here and there. Well, this is a French invention. Fleur-de-lis, the lily flower, that's what that means. Lis is lily, fleur is flower. Bottom line, what became part of the iconography in French Christianity is that the fleur-de-lis had become associated with Mary, the mother of Christ. And the idea of the fleur-de-lis, the lily flower, the lily was seen to be pure and seen to be beautiful, chaste. So by this time, 1700, it is everything French, like I say, even to the point that shows up on the St. Louis flags. We still have a lot of French legacy here. Creve Coeur, Broken Heart, that's French. Florissant, Land of Flowers, St. Louis. Choteau Avenue, Gravois, just say it. And so anyway, this is the fleur-de-lis. And this is Louis XIV. And so anyway, there's been a lot of analysis about this piece, by the way, too. And we see that it is pretty exact in its depiction of the cloth, of the ermine. It's a kind of an animal that they skin for the fur, and that's what this is. The satin and silk and all of that, the shine, the jeweled sword, all of that is very technically well done. And so we'll take a quick look at French architecture of the era. And so because by the 17th century, they're really becoming prosperous. France looks nothing like the Netherlands, like the Low Countries. They take their wealth and they build these monumental places. And this is the Louvre, which was a palace, and now it is an art museum. It's one of the great museums of the world. And so this was 17th century French architecture. And you see it still is reminiscent of the classical architecture with the columns and so on. It's not overly ornate, which kind of puts it into the Baroque period. We're going to see the Rococo period here pretty soon, and you'll see that the French kind of go way over the top with ornamentation. The palace at Versailles. And this is what I'm talking about being over the top. The Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. And so that's where this guy lives. Palace of Versailles. And they are not at all like the Dutch. They are wealthy, they are powerful, they, in a lot of ways, neglect the common people, which is why by the end of the 18th century, they have a huge problem. Like the French Revolution. But at any rate, this is how they live. Lifestyles of the rich and famous. And this is how they spent their money. And Apollo attended by the nymphs of Thetis. Anyway, this is all sculpture from the Palace of Versailles. Bottom line, they're going right back. They're going right back to, they're trying to rival what was going on in Rome and what was going on with the Counter Reformation and all of the sculpture by Bernini and the fountains and everything. The French are doing this on their own. Here it is. This is where that statue exists. Here it is. There it is. And so, yeah, they had these little grottos. They have, this is just landscape, mansion-esque luxury. The Royal Chapel, which is there at Versailles. Some got their own private church. Not a small thing. And so this is what they do. I want to point this out here too, because this is kind of creeping up in here too. They really kind of go back to some of that classical stuff. Apollo attended by the nymphs. We know who Apollo is. It's a Roman god. In Arcadia Ego. This is classicism. This is pretty much along the same lines of the sculpture I just showed. And so they go back and they take stock in classical themes. Nicholas Poussin, landscape with St. John on Patmos. And what this is, the old St. John the Apostle, and he kind of lives out his golden years, if you will, on Patmos, which is an island, and you can see some of the classical architecture, and you can see here, he's actually writing the Bible. He's writing probably the Gospel according to John, and probably the book of Revelation. Again, classical, burial, Phocion. Bottom line, orderly, classical, and again, this was quite different from the Netherlands. Claude Lorraine starts to kind of take in some more of what the Dutch are doing. Ordinary people. These things are not mutually exclusive. These are themes that are running through these cultures. But there is this realism that comes through. in French art of 17th century. And the name, country people, again, there's Louis the Ninth, Louis the 14th, Louis, all of these guys. And then you got this. Now you got the classicism of Versailles, and then you got this, country people. Realism. This is French realism. I talked to you about Dutch realism. This is French realism. And Hanging Tree from the Miseries of War series. Sometimes these things actually, this is awful. Here, George de la Tour. Taking some of the techniques of Caravaggioism, Tenebrism, chiaroscuro, and they got the Adoration of the Shepherds. That's baby Christ. That is Mary and Joseph and the shepherds at the birth of Christ. And again, like I was saying earlier, they really figured out how to do candle light. That was like a big thing. That's what makes this in some ways more sophisticated than what we see from Caravaggio, which Caravaggism is like all lit from the front. We see these people bringing in their own light sources. More 17th century architecture, this from London. Christopher Wren, one of the great architects of London. And again, the English were a lot like the French. They had a lot of money, they had a lot of colonies, and they came back home and they spent it on stuff like this. St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and that is that. And I wanted to show you, if I can get to this. And let me make sure I'm sharing the proper screen there. I want to talk to you today. I want you to see this. It's a 10-minute video. And it's about formal analysis. And it is one of the ways that we analyze artworks. Of course, there's many factors analyzing an artwork. I try to throw in as many as relevant, as easy to be seen, the more obvious ones. And so there are a lot of factors. One is who paid for this and what is the subject matter. So we see Louis the 14th. Boom. We know this is about royalty. We see a lot of Christ images and things. We know that the church had sponsored this artwork. We see different kinds of things. That's why this realism, in a lot of ways, is relatively new and relatively unique. It's an idea that will gain in popularity over the next couple of centuries, but it's a little different than what we've seen for the most part. But that being said, those are the kinds of things we can do. Economic analysis, we can kind of figure out how much something is worth. We can do provenance, where the history of who owned this, who commissioned it, how many times has it changed hands, was it stolen by the Germans in World War II, etc. But formal analysis is really kind of a fundamental, time-tested way of analyzing artwork. And I thought this was a pretty good video. It's from Khan Academy. And let's take a look at it.
We're in the National Gallery in London, standing in front of Giovanni Bellini's The Madonna of the Meadow. This is a Renaissance painting from Venice, but we wanted to talk about it as a vehicle to highlight the tools of visual analysis.
So here's what we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about iconography, how this painting fits in with the history of paintings of the Madonna and Child. We're not going to talk about the symbolism that we might see in some of the animals in the background. We're not going to talk about the commission or who the patron was.
We're not going to talk about the political, social, or economic context in which this painting was made. Instead, we're going to focus on the things we can see. So we're going to talk about scale, composition, pictorial space, form, line, color, light, tone, texture, and pattern.
Let's start with the issue of scale. So here we can talk about the scale of the painting and the scale of the figures and what we see in the painting.
Well, we're in a gallery with paintings of all different sizes. There are very large altarpieces and there are some very small paintings as well. This is a moderately sized painting, and it changes where we stand in relationship to the painting. When you stand in front of a very large painting, you tend to stand back. You take it all in. Whereas when you walk up to a very small painting, we tend to come in very close to see as much as we can.
We see a female figure who's smaller than life size.
But she fills a third of the frame.
And that brings us to the composition. Not only does she fill a third of the frame, but the clothing that she's wearing, the drapery, spreads out across the bottom length of the painting.
Creating, in essence, a pyramid. The base of a pyramid is broad.
And pyramids are a very stable form. We also notice that the child in her lap is contained within the pyramidal shape of her body. So there is an intimacy that's created between the female figure and the child.
The artist has placed her very close to the foreground so that she towers over the horizon line and is clearly the primary subject. But there is also a significant amount of landscape that surrounds her that, in a sense, frames her. Bellini has created this pyramidal foreground in front of a series of what are really horizontal bands that move back into space. You see a band in the foreground of greenery, then there's a band of pebbles, then there's a band of tilled farmland. And even the clouds create horizontal bands in the sky.
She's framed on one side by trees and on the other side by the vertical forms of the architecture.
Another way we can talk about composition is to think about the way in which the artist has composed the bodies of the figures. Look at the lovely, gentle tilt to the Virgin Mary's head, which corresponds to the angle of the Christ child's head. But I'm also struck by the volume in between the hands of the Virgin Mary, who holds her fingertips together, defining an eternal space that has the same kind of volume as her own head and that of the child.
The diagonal line that forms the slope of her right shoulder corresponds to the diagonal line of her forearm and the diagonal line of the child's body. So we have this echoing of forms that helps to unify the composition.
Let's turn next to pictorial space.
We should acknowledge that we're looking at a flat surface, and that what the artist is doing is creating an illusion of three-dimensional form and an illusion of space on this flat surface. Let's start with the figure. She's seated on the ground with a child on her lap. So we have immediately a sense of one thing in front of another because of overlapping.
But in addition, pictorial space is defined by what we would call atmospheric and linear perspective. If we look at the sky at the top of the painting, the sky that is closest to us, it has deep, rich blues. And as the sky moves back in space towards the horizon, it becomes paler. Look at the mountains in the distance, how they become paler and bluer. This is a technique that's meant to replicate the natural phenomena of looking at a great distance, looking through more atmosphere. Details become less vivid, color becomes paler, things become bluer.
We also notice a little bit of linear perspective if we look at the plowed fields, where we see diagonal lines that appear to recede into the distance that lead our eye back into space.
Those lines are called orthogonals. They meet at a vanishing point, which in the context of this painting is obscured by the Virgin Mary and Child in the foreground, but which nevertheless creates a sense of logic and places us, the viewer, in a particular point in space in relationship to the image that we're seeing.
Let's turn next to the question of form.
Generally, when we speak about form, we're thinking about the representation of solids in space. And it's instructive to think about the variety of types of form that the artist is representing.
Well, we have the natural forms. We have trees and grass and fields and mountains and clouds. We also have figurative forms, the Madonna and Child in the foreground, but we also have built forms. We have the architecture in the background. Some of these forms are rounded and curvilinear, like the Virgin Mary and the Christ Child, or even the clouds, and some of them are rectilinear, like the architecture in the background.
Some of them feel very solid, like the figures in the foreground. And some of the form is far more delicate. Look at the handling, for example, of the leaves on the trees.
Those forms are established just by touches of color from the artist's brush.
Now, form is often defined by line.
And in fact, there are contour lines used to demarcate and separate forms. So for example, separating the Virgin Mary's drapery from the grass that she sits on. And we also have places where we have line on its own, for example, in the branches of the tree. Line is also sometimes the corners of forms. I'm looking at the line that forms the edge of the squared turret.
Next, we wanted to talk about color.
One is immediately struck by the rich blue of the Virgin's mantle, but also the deep blue of the sky. And that contrasts with the earth colors, the browns and greens that we see in the fields around and behind her.
There are essentially three main color groups. There's the brilliant blue of the Virgin's mantle, of the sky, of the mountains. There's the red of her undergarment. And then there's the yellows of the flesh, of the fields, and of the architecture. These are the three primary colors.
We see white in the shawl that she wears around her head and also in the clouds. So Mary is connected with the heavens.
Color is in some ways a function of light. And here the artist is creating a sense of a broad light of a clear day.
The light from the sun seems to be coming from the left, maybe a little bit forward from the figures.
And high in the sky.
And we see the clouds illuminated from above, they're in shadow below. Similarly with the Virgin Mary, if you look at her right forearm, it's illuminated from above, but in shadow below.
And so the artist has taken pains to create a consistent use of light and shadow. That is, shadow is always in accordance with the source of that light.
Look at the Virgin Mary's face. Her right cheek is illuminated, but the left side of the cheek is in shadow, and we have a sense of moving tones from light into darkness, what art historians often call chiaroscuro. And this helps to create a form that looks three-dimensional, that appears to exist in space.
But light and color are both closely related to tone as well.
And tone refers to the amount of light and darkness in a color.
And we can see that in many parts of this painting. We can see it in the cloak of the Virgin Mary, but it's probably most subtly handled in the representation of flesh. Looking at the beautiful rendering of the Virgin Mary's face and the smooth brushwork makes me aware of the variety of textures within this painting and the contrast that the artist is creating between the smooth textures of the flesh or of the cloth that the figures wear in comparison to the rough, pebbly surface that we see in the middle ground.
Or we could look at the featheriness of the leaves on the trees, which are yet another texture.
Texture is a tool that artists can use to create a sense of veracity as they define different kinds of form.
And texture is intimately related to the materials that the artist is using. Here, we know it's oil paint, which is well suited to the depiction of different textures.
Let's talk next about pattern. You might not expect to see pattern in a landscape, which is filled with natural forms, because pattern is the repetition of a form over and over again, often to create a decorative field.
Here we see ornamentation in the Virgin Mary's blue robe. We see some gold embroidery.
If you look closely, there is a soft, organic pattern, especially in the foreground, in the foliage.
We do see the repetition of leaf forms and grass forms that look almost like a carpet, like a decorative field, than the unruliness of nature.
And one of the results of pattern is that it is often in conflict with pictorial space for the illusionistic depth that the artist renders. And even here, it seems as if that green field stands up a little bit in a way that reminds us that this is in fact a two-dimensional surface. So by looking at scale and composition of pictorial space, at form, line, color, light, tone, at the textures and the patterns, we have an opportunity to look closely at the painting. But these are only a few of the tools that art historians use to discuss and explore works of art. Solid, like.
And so And so let me get this right screen share. Looks like we're good. So what'd you guys think of that film? Is there a lot of stuff you already knew?
Yeah,
Kind of. Well, I bring it in because I'm often talking about some of the same things, and especially talking about orthogonals, excuse me. The 1 point perspective, the atmospheric perspective, et cetera, et cetera. But for a long time, and especially when I was been talking about this period of time, one of the goals, no matter if they're doing realism or they're doing portraits of royalty or they're doing, in this case, Madonna and Child, is they use the word veracity, truthfulness, realism, and that is really something that you can kind of expect from the first thing we saw here. And these are the kinds of characteristics that, and as they said in the film, art historians sometimes use these terms and analyze the work this way. I think to a point where we actually kind of take this for granted. And it's what we expect. It's fine. These are artworks, they're in art history. We've been kind of chronicling the perfection of some of these various aspects of form. I thought it was interesting. They talked about a little bit of chiaroscuro that was inside Mary's cloak, her hood, and the side of her face. And it was the darkness versus the light that defined the left cheek, chiaroscuro, dark modeling, etc. We saw that in subsequent centuries turn into Caravaggioism and so on, de la Tour. We got to a point where they could create the illusion of candlelight. So this is all formal stuff. And it's not the totality. It's just a way of looking at things. And there's a theory or a keyword that should have been overlaid for all of this. And they didn't use it. The word being unity, because that is really what this is all about. You can't create the illusion of objects in a three-dimensional space unless you have some kind of unified composition and unified textures in space. Don't believe me, just take something, take a photograph, cut and paste and put something in a different environment and it looks like something that was cut and paste because the light's different, the shadows are different, the color's different. It's not unified. You can tell that. It's actually pretty easy to see unless you're like really good with Photoshop, and then you can kind of clean it up. But unity was always the thing. If you take a look at art prior to what we've seen in this class, we'll see that a lot of the art almost looks like stickers. They're little images that they could have been decals that were put on the wall. And what I'm thinking about hieroglyphics, for example, in Egypt, you could kind of flatten those out, make stickers of them and put them in, and that would be the art. But this video explains what they were trying to do and how they were doing it. And so I'm running a little late. I do want to introduce you to this. And that is this idea of neoclassicism. I already kind of introduced that to you already. That was happening in France, and they were really very keen on going back to mythology. Angelica Kaufman, Cornelia presenting her children as treasures, or the mother of the Geraci. We don't really have an idea what the real painting is, title. But it's late 18th century. It's in England. It was Angelica Kaufman was an English painter. And so what you have here, she's presenting her children as her treasures. You got the woman over here that's got the jewelry and the stuff. She's the rich person in here. Cornelia says, no, my wealth are my 3 children. So what we see is this. We see a lot of that stuff we just saw, the kind of putting together a unified composition, and they're going back to classicism, and they're co-opting it to fit the morality or the zeitgeist of the time. And so I'm gonna quit. You okay with that? I want to say a couple of things. One, we don't have class on Monday. It's the mental health day the president declared, which is why I'm a little reticent to go too deep in this, because we're not going to see each other for a whole week. Second thing is that if you haven't completed quiz 2, please do it. I'm begging to say. And so the next big issue here will be the paper. And so part of the reason I talked about try to get this video in here, hopefully if you need the vocabulary to talk about formal analysis, you can find it right there in that video. And so, hearing no objections, class dismissed.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet, Mackenzie. And show way too many tabs open. And part of the thing was I was going to show you a Rembrandt film too that would come up. Oh well, we can just have a great week, you guys.
You too.
Bye. See you later, Caleb.